I try to kick off every session with this quote. I think this kind of really embodies what we're all here for. There's only one thing more painful than learning from experience, and that is not learning from experience. And the conservation standards, adaptive conservation as a whole, that's what this is all about, gaining experience, gaining knowledge so that we can continuously improve conservation over time. And of course, we are talking about adaptive conservation at the end of the day. Well, the conservation standards is kind of the theme of this workshop. And, we often talk about the conservation standards as the tool. It is the means to an ends, right? The standards are a tool used to achieve adaptive conservation. And by following a sequence of steps through the conservation standards process, we can achieve adaptive conservation and be evidence-based in our decision making, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. When we talk about adaptive conservation, whether it's the conservation standards or some other framework, what we're trying to really get at is, are we doing the right things? Are we doing them well? Or another way to say that is, could we be doing them better? And ultimately, are we achieving our desired impact? So at the end of the day, we need to be able to answer that third question, which requires us to make an objective statement of what that impact is so we can determine whether it is being achieved or not, so that if it's not, we can adapt. And what I'm going to focus the conversation on today when we talk about focal value health is that first step in being able to determine what that statement of achievement of impact really is. So focal value health is the main topic for discussion right now. And when we talk about focal value health, we're talking about the ecological integrity or the viability of the focal values within the geographic scope of the plan. The purpose of this step is to set a baseline so that we can actually generate evidence as to whether the state of biodiversity or human well-being or biocultural features, whatever is reflected as your focal values, that the state of those things is changing in response to the actions and strategies that we implement. That's the entire purpose of this step. So without a clear baseline of health, we cannot actually monitor whether we're achieving success for those biodiversity values, those focal values, those biocultural values, or human well-being values in this case. We can't actually determine whether that success is being achieved, and therefore we cannot implement adaptive management or adaptive conservation. This is so critical. This is a keystone step in this process for it to have the structural integrity of achieving adaptive management over time. And it's one that often gets overlooked because it can get complicated. So we tend to skip it, or we don't really give it the time and attention that it requires, or we leave blanks because we don't really have good data. We need to get past this. If we really want to achieve adaptive management, adaptive conservation, and be able to generate the evidence as to what's working and what's not working, this step is really, really critical. And I hope I can really hammer that message home today during this session. If we go back to our definition, so it is the ecological integrity or the viability of the focal values within the geographic scope of the plan. There's two concepts embedded in this definition that we have to have a grasp of to even be able to start doing this step properly. And that is focal values and geographic scope. When we talk about geographic scope, we're talking about the clearly defined boundaries within which the plan is intended to have a positive influence. That boundary needs to be clearly articulated to everybody on the planning team. So we know exactly where we want to have a benefit for the focal values and where we're going to monitor whether that benefit is occurring or not. If different people have a different idea of the spatial reality of the plan, then we don't have alignment. People are going to be talking past each other instead of to each other. We can't have an effective dialogue. There's a reason this is one of the most earliest steps, and it might change over time given the iterative nature of the conservation standards. You might come back and change a boundary, but it is really important that you come to a clear decision as a team on what the boundary is within which we want to have a positive influence. And of course, everybody knows what a map is. We can show you here. This is an example of one of the community nominated priority place initiatives, the Chignecto Isthmus map. The area in green is the area within which that team decided this is where we're going to have a positive influence. And they included a secondary scope. You can see this kind of highlighted area. This is the Sictic Mi'kmaq district within New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And so it was acknowledged that there would be some additional benefits that might spill out from the area within which we want to have a positive influence. And so that was reflected as kind of the secondary scope. But really important in this step is to have that clear understanding of where we want to have a positive benefit for the focal values and where we're going to monitor whether that benefit is being achieved. Why is this important? Because all conservation is spatial. Every conservation action strategy ever implemented and ever will be implemented has a spatial component. And it's really important, once again, that a planning team has a shared understanding of that. It removes the subjectivity or risk of misunderstanding of where we want to have a positive influence. And within that scope, again, where we need to monitor whether that positive influence is being achieved. So that's geographic scope. And then next, which I think has been the topic for most of the day, is this concept of focal values. Of course, it includes the biodiversity features within the geographic scope that the plan is trying to focus on to conserve and restore. Again, sequence of steps is important here. It's not at large. We define the boundary within which we want to have a positive influence, and then we talk about what are the biodiversity features within that boundary that we're actually going to try and benefit and monitor whether we're having that benefit. And of course, everybody knows this. It can be a species, piping plover. It could be a group of species. This photo might represent shorebirds in that context. It could be an ecological community or an ecosystem. So we've got a beach system here. But we're not limited to biodiversity. It can also be biocultural features that the team is aiming to aiming to conserve and or restore, right? Local and indigenous knowledge, social institutions, spirituality, oral history, traditions, culturally significant areas and sites. Basically anything that we feel needs attention to conserve and or restore, whether it's biocultural, whether it's biodiversity, can be included as a focal value in a plan. So there's no limit to what you're defining as a focal value. It's important to keep this in mind. If we go back to the example looking at the Chignecto-Isthmus Community Nominated Priority Place, within that green area, these are made up for the sake of the presentation, by the way, we might have a species focal value, black-throated blue warbler. We really want to focus on an individual species. We might have an ecosystem focal value, Wabanaki forest. And you can see there's all kinds of nested values within this. I want to hopefully address a question that was asked just before my presentation around nested values and overlap. It doesn't matter whether there's overlap. A nested value is not an indicator. You might choose to go through your nested values and pick some out because they might be effective indicators. The nested values just reflect the things that, if we're successful in conserving and or restoring the focal value, in this case, Wabanaki forest, these are the other things we care about that we hope will benefit from that. So that's all a nested value is. It's just listing out, acknowledging the things that people feel are important. And we can't create a plan that includes every one of these individually, right? We group them together into a focal value that we can actually design a plan around. So for example, if you're with a group of people, maybe it's multiple organizations working together, and we say, okay, what are the things we feel are really important within our geographic scope? And people are yelling stuff out: blue-felt lichen, chaga, fishers, evening grosbeak, right? We're just capturing all those things so we can acknowledge these are what the team feels are important. And then we do our grouping exercise to figure out how we're going to narrow this down into a manageable number of planning units, and those become the focal values. We could have biocultural focal values or strictly cultural values as well. They don't have to have anything to do with biodiversity. This is one that we're working on right now, Mi'kmaq land and water use. The Mi'kmaq land and water use was used for the community nominated priority place, but the family leaders is one that we're working on right now in Big Glace Bay Lake. And so this represents those family leaders, the image that you see on the screen. So once we have an understanding of what the focal values are that we're going to try to benefit, then we can move into focal value health. And we want to answer three questions. What defines a healthy focal value? How do we define healthy black-throated blue warbler, healthy Wabanaki forest, healthy Mi'kmaq land and water use? How do we actually measure that health? And ultimately, we're answering the first two questions so we can get to the third. What is the focal values health now? Again, the purpose is to set a baseline against which we can compare over time whether that health is improving as a result of the actions and strategies that we're implementing. If we can't set a baseline, there is no way to define success and to determine whether that success is being achieved. Ultimately, we want to rate that focal value health as being either very good, good, fair, or poor. And we do this by capturing the current state of knowledge on the focal value. Current state of knowledge is really key here. It is not peer-reviewed literature, right? The current state of knowledge might be a best guess by the people in the room. That's perfectly fine as a starting point. If we feel like the best guess isn't good enough, we can always build into the plan a strategy to improve on that information. But current state of knowledge is really key here. That might be peer-reviewed literature. Oftentimes it's not. We don't have perfect knowledge, perfect data about these biodiversity and biocultural values and what their current health is. And that's perfectly okay. It's part of the adaptive conservation process. So we define what key attributes are, basically an important characteristic that can help us understand the health of our focal value. And then the thing we're actually going to measure consistently over time, the indicator. We define what very good, good, fair, and poor are in relation to that indicator, and then we define what that current status is. So if we go back to our examples, we have a species focal value, black-throated blue warbler. One way to assess the health might look like this. So the focal value, black-throated blue warbler, the key attribute in this case is fledgling success. The indicator is the proportion of chicks fledged per eggs laid. And we have indicator ratings: poor, fair, good, very good. Usually when I give this presentation, I use population size as my example key attribute. I specifically didn't here because of the context within which many of you are working, dealing with national wildlife areas, marine migratory migratory bird sanctuaries. Measuring population size for migratory birds within a specific boundary of an NWA or a sanctuary doesn't make any sense. In this particular case, you have no influence on the population size. What's causing a decline of some of these species may have nothing to do with what's going on, likely has nothing to do with what's going on within the protected area boundary or the country for that matter. It could be in their southern breeding range. In their migratory range in the south. So measuring population size is not a good measure of health for your geographic scope because you have no influence over that. You need to think about what you can influence within your geographic scope. And that's why coming back to maps and having that geography clearly defined early on is so important. You can affect fledgling success, at least hypothetically, right? There might be things that you can do to, I don't know, reduce invasive species or reduce predation or who knows what, right? But hypothetically, at least, this is something we can actually influence within our geographic scope, given the context that we're working in. How did poor, fair, good, and very good get defined? Who knows? Maybe we have some literature that we can draw from that provides some indication of thresholds. This might just be a best guess by the people in the room. That's perfectly fine as a starting point. As long as we acknowledge a rough guess is a rough guess, that's perfectly okay. Just be transparent about where the information came from. In the absence of anything better, it's still better than nothing. We don't want blanks in the map. It's just going to paralyze our ability to actually take action and monitor change over time. So based on these kind of goalposts, poor, fair, good, and very good, we come up with what is the reasonable definitions for each one of those. There is no right answer to what is poor, fair, good, and very good. That's something teams often have a little bit of discomfort with. They are inherently subjective. There will never be objectively correct definitions. We're trying to understand what is reasonable, and we can improve on these over time as we get better information through implementation or through external sources. The definitions along the bottom can help us think about how we start the conversation to define those ratings. So if we start on the far right-hand side, very good. The desirable status requires little intervention for maintenance. Good, within an acceptable range of variation, some intervention may be required for maintenance. Fair, outside some acceptable range of variation, requires human intervention. And poor, may result in extirpation without significant human intervention. So very good, slam dunk. Basically, if it's in that category, we don't really need to do much. Good is good, but it could be better, and we could take action to improve things. Fair, not good, and it's likely to get worse if we don't take action. And poor, critical zone, if we don't take action, we're going to lose it. Those generic definitions can kind of help inform the discussion on where the goalposts are when we talk about defining those indicator ratings specifically in relation to the indicator. If we go to another example for a species, same focal value, black-throated blue warbler, instead of looking at the species itself, maybe we take a different approach and look at available habitat. So what's the total area of mature, deciduous, and mixed wood forest within this geographic scope, right? And again, we can come up with indicator ratings. Maybe we have an understanding of what the historic extent used to be, and we use that to inform good or very good. Again, there's no right way to do this. We want to take whatever best available information is accessible to us and use that to have an informed discussion with the planning team to figure out what are reasonable definitions of poor, fair, good, and very good. The definitions along the bottom are exactly the same. I won't go over those again. But ultimately, excuse me, we want to understand what the current status is to give everybody that shared understanding of which category we're in now. So in this example, knowing that we're in 1,000, we have 1,080 hectares of mature deciduous and mixed wood forest, it puts us in the good category. If we go to our Wabanaki Forest ecosystem focal value, one way to measure health could be the maturity of the forest. So the proportion of that forest greater than 80 years old. Different parts of the country, that threshold will be very different. In Atlantic Canada, 80 years is often considered the threshold against which a lot of the early successional trees start to die off, and you get some of that forest structure, which an old forest provides for many old forest-dependent species. And again, what the indicator ratings are is totally subjective. It's about finding what the team feels is reasonable, using whatever information is available to us to inform those decisions. And then lastly, if we look at a biocultural focal value made by land and water use, a key attribute here, this is a common one when working with Indigenous groups, is access. Having access to traditional foods, ceremony, right? Could be a whole variety of different things. So one of the key attributes here is access to berries as a food source. And the indicator that we're going to measure to understand whether that attribute is being achieved or not is the proportion of elders that have access to berries. This was slightly adapted from a real indicator in one of the projects that I facilitated. The indicator ratings are correct, but I think in the project that I was facilitating, they were actually looking at salmon. But same concept, right? We come up with what poor, fair, good, and very good are. There is no right answer to those, what is reasonable, and then we figure out where we are currently. And you can see here very firmly in the poor status. So those are some examples of focal value health assessments. Some considerations. There is a tendency to turn this into a laundry list of things that we wish we could measure. We really need to narrow this down to as few meaningful key attributes as possible that will allow us to understand whether the health of the focal value is changing over time. Focus on the need to haves, not the nice to haves. It's actually going to cost time and money to monitor these things over time. We have to take into account the practical side. We are not creating a literature review. This is an action plan. So we need to be strategic and focused, narrow this down to the need to haves. We really want to select indicators that are efficient and affordable to measure. So use existing data sources wherever we can. I will say it is not uncommon to realize that in some cases, decades of monitoring and research on specific species or ecosystems is simply not fit for purpose to inform an action plan appropriately. And there's many examples of this. So oftentimes we don't have the data sources that we want, and we build into the plan specific monitoring pieces to try and get at the data we need to understand whether that health is changing in our geographic scope specifically. And really important, you're going to hear this numerous times today, it's important to embrace the subjective nature of this process. We do not have perfect knowledge of anything, any biodiversity or biocultural value in the world. We do not have perfect knowledge. There will always be some subjective nature to defining indicator ratings. We're really trying to focus on what's reasonable, not what's right. These can be updated over time. We don't have to get afraid that something's going to get put down on a piece of paper and we're going to get held accountable to it. This is meant to be iterative. We start with the best available information, and then we build into the plan the need to improve on that information over time. And that is the heart of adaptive conservation. Dealing with uncertainty. We have to get comfortable with uncertainty. Do not let precision be the enemy of action. There should never be a blank spot in any of these plans. A rough guess is better than nothing. I really hope everybody internalizes this information, because this is one of the biggest tripping points in this process. I know it gets complicated. We get really uncomfortable if we don't have a peer-reviewed article to cite. We got to shed that. A best guess by the planning team is still better than nothing. It gives us a reference point that we can actually test. You can't test assumptions unless you make assumptions. So in the absence of true evidence about something, making an assumption, being transparent that it's an assumption as a starting point is perfectly okay. It is an iterative process. We can and should update these assessments as new information becomes available. Again, the whole idea here is these are not plans that are static for the next 10 years. These are supposed to be living documents that we're updating as we're gaining new knowledge through implementation. And don't accept we don't know. To test assumptions, we need to make assumptions. Really, really important. Also important to document those areas of uncertainty. Again, we don't want to lead anybody into thinking we have better knowledge than we actually do. It's important to be transparent. Say, you know what, this is just a rough guess by the team. When we talk about goals, formal SMART statements of the desired future health of a focal value, right? Everybody knows what SMART means: specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, time-bound, specific criteria. The point here is not to have vague statements of success. Increase the population of black-throated blue warblers. That is meaningless. One person might think an increase in one individual is success. One person might think an increase of 100 individuals is success. You need to be very clear about what it is we're trying to achieve, and that's why those health assessments are so important. So we choose a focal value, choose one of the key attributes, and then write a draft description of the future desired condition based on the indicator. I'll show you some examples here really quickly. I'm going to go through. So if we go back to our species example, we had an example of a health assessment looking at fledgling success, the percent of chicks fledged per eggs laid. A goal could be by 2035, the proportion of black-throated blue warbler chicks fledged per eggs laid has increased from 62% to 66% or more within the, in this case, the Pretendia National Wildlife Area. It's specific, it names the focal value, it names the geographic scope. It's measurable. We have a to and from value, 62% to 66%. We'll assume it's achievable. It's a little bit more subjective, and a team needs to have a conversation around what they think is realistic, right? But we'll assume in this case that this is achievable. It's results oriented. In this case, they're getting from the fair category to the good category, right? Again, it provides a goalpost for a team to have an understanding of how we're actually moving the needle in a positive direction. You don't always have to jump categories. Sometimes that's not possible. Maybe all you can do is hold the line in some cases. That's fine. But at least this gives us some anchor points to have a discussion around. And it's time bound by 2035. There is a one-to-one relationship between the health of your focal value and the goal. The goal is a statement of future health, and it should be directly connected to the indicator. Similarly, if we look at available habitat, by 2030, the total area of mature deciduous and mixedwood forest habitat for black-throated blue warblers within the Pretendia National Wildlife Area will not fall below the current amount of 1,080 hectares. You can copy this goal, paste it somewhere so that people who are not even part of this process read it, and they'll still know exactly what it is you're trying to achieve. There is no risk of subjectivity, misinterpretation. This is a clearly defined measure of success, and that's what we're trying to achieve in this step. Wabanaki Forest. By 2050, the proportion of Wabanaki Forest in the Pretendia National Wildlife Area is greater than 80, that is greater than 80 years old, will increase from 51% to 64% or more. You guys get the picture. Same thing with biocultural or cultural goals. By 2028, the proportion of elders that have access to berries in the Pretendia National Wildlife Area will increase from 2% to 80% or more to support the continuation of Mi'kmaq land and water use. So really, really important to maintain the structural integrity of an adaptive conservation plan. There is a one-to-one relationship between your health assessment and your statement of success, i.e. your goal. Really, really critical. And this is often a misunderstood part of the process. Couple take-home messages. It is both an art and a science to conduct health assessments, and it's hands down the most challenging step in this entire process. It's very time consuming. It can get tedious. We get into the weeds about data and indicators and all that type of stuff, but it is foundational to maintaining the structural integrity of an adaptive management process. So please don't cut corners. If you want your plan to actually generate evidence as to whether your management is improving your focal values, this step has to be done. Overlooking, postponing, or approaching this step superficially is undermining the effectiveness of planning efforts. If we can't track a change in the state of biodiversity or biocultural diversity or human well-being or whatever values you are trying to conserve and restore as a result of the actions and strategies that we're implementing, it is not adaptive management, period. And you can call it conservation standards if you want to, but it's not adaptive management. And it's important to acknowledge the tool being used to achieve a specific outcome, which is adaptive management. And we need to be transparent about that. No conservation plan ever created was built with perfect knowledge. As Western scientists, we kind of have this inherent discomfort with making decisions in the face of uncertainty. But the reality is, this is actually holding us back from taking meaningful action for nature. These gaps in information and this planning paralysis, because we don't have all the data, it's not helping anybody, including nature, definitely nature. So we need to make assumptions so that we can test those assumptions and get comfortable with that uncertainty. A rough guess is still better than a blank page. Focus on what's reasonable rather than what's right, and build those knowledge gaps into the plan to improve that information over time. Remember that we're working in a crisis discipline, and you folks are on the front lines with national wildlife areas and migratory bird sanctuaries. These are critically important places for Canadian nature. So I really encourage us, try to get comfortable with this uncertainty, make assumptions, be transparent about rough guesses. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's ultimately going to move the needle much, much quicker than needing to wait for research to get information before we can take action. So that is my soapbox. I'll step off it now. Thank you again, everybody, for giving me some time to present. Many people, I think, have already downloaded this book. I just produced a book. It's freely available, provides kind of some step-by-step guidance when you're working with teams, how to go through the conservation standards and develop a effective plan. So this is a little gift to you if you find it useful. So thanks again, everybody.